Welcome to the HR Huddle podcast, presented by Sapient Insights Group, the ultimate resource for all things HR. It's time to get in the huddle.
Hello, everyone. I am Stacey Harris. I am your host here for Spilling the Tea on HR Tech. Welcome back to everybody. We're really excited to have you join us. We're mid-fall season. I don't know wherever you're at, but hopefully you're seeing beautiful leaves and gorgeous reds and golds out your window, just like I am today. But we are just getting into the heart of what is the busiest time for the HR technology market. And so joining me today on my podcast is Teri Zipper, our CEO at Sapient Insights. But more importantly, she's one of the most amazing people that I know when it comes to HR technology, because she has been both a practitioner as well as a consultant, as well as you've worked inside of systems as well, Teri. So you've pretty much done it all, haven't you?
Done it all.
Yeah. I love it. Every once in a while, somebody's like, so what do you do? And I'm like, well, I make sure people get paid because I talk about it a lot. But I said, but really, we do so many things when it comes to HR technology, don't we?
We do. Yeah, it is amazing. I was just on another podcast where I was talking about just the interconnectedness across all systems and how HR continues to add new things, right? As soon as something new comes up, let's figure out how to get that into our technology so that it can become part of our full ecosystem.
Yes, very much so. And what's so fun about it is that it's always changing, it's always evolving. And yet there are so many things that tend to stay the same. I mean, we kind of learned that. A couple of things we're going to be talking about this week are how some of the big shifts are taking place in the market for acquisitions and changes, but also we had the opportunity to speak to, I would say, probably one of the youngest sort of advisory groups that we've had the opportunity to speak to previously. And it was great to get a chance to share with them some of the things that, we knew from our historical past in HR and HR technology and consulting that they're getting a chance to now see through their experiences. And that was kind of fun to see next generation of consultants coming into the HR technology space.
Yes, definitely. And it also, I think, more to your point in the survey this year, just the number of people that have fewer than 500 employees, how much HR technology they're buying.
Yes. Yeah. The smaller companies on average, right, now doing 3 to 5 systems. I think when I first started, I can remember the conversation when I started research in the space with Lexi Martin, who used to run this survey many years ago. And I remember her saying, boy, companies under 200 employees just generally don't buy HR technology. That was just about 10 years ago. And now I think we're pretty clear that really many companies aren't even going to paper. They're just skipping right over that and starting with technology as soon as they've got their first employee these days. So I think, we're seeing a very shift in the market. So today's going to be a great conversation. We're going to have just about half an hour. We're going to be covering really 4 or 5 topics if we can get to them all today. We'll be talking a little bit about the Cornerstone event. I got a chance to do that about 2 weeks ago. I've been on the road nonstop for the last couple of weeks. And so I haven't even had a chance to write up a conversation about it, but I wanted to share some insights from the Cornerstone's conference and some of the announcements they made last week. And then also a little bit about Oracle HCM. They had their user conference as well, both of them out in Las Vegas. I was able to spend a little bit of time with them. We'll talk about that. We're also going to spend some time talking about some visits that Teri and I did up in Chicago. We had an opportunity to speak to the Investors RoundTable of Chief HR Officers up in Chicago at the Waldorf Astoria. Very nice environment to be doing a presentation in, but it was a nice panel. We presented information on the panel along with our friends from Deloitte and Korn Ferry and another panelist who was there as a customer speaking about the conversation on HR technology for chief HR officers in that particular industry. And then we also at that same time visited a client who, as we noted, we did a little bit of a training and education session at that event. It's a consulting client who leverages our research. And we also had a visit to AtlasHXM, which is an interesting organization now doing what we would consider employer of record for international hires. So a busy week for me and you, Teri, and we're going to try and get through some of this as a conversation week. Maybe just to start with the Cornerstone event, because that's probably been about 2 weeks past now. They had their users conference. It was quite well attended. I've gone to the Cornerstone Users Conference for, the last probably 10 years, maybe even 15. Cornerstone was the last learning management system that I had put in place when I was a practitioner inside of an organization. And so I think the first one I got to go to was actually as a practitioner. And then after that, I had always attended as a researcher, analyst, and a consultant. And they really had a lot of big announcements at this year's conference for themselves. Not only did we see them really weigh in heavily on the skills management space, but they also had just recently acquired SumTotal, which brought their total number of clients and customers in that organization to over 7,000 organizations. They really are at this point the largest learning solutions provider in the market. And they're investing heavily in skills management through some of their acquisitions of an LXP provider. They're also investing heavily in reimagining services and support and content inside of the organization. There was a lot of announcements about new content suite for curating and managing content. But probably my favorite thing, and Teri, I'd love to get your thoughts on this because you've worked in the industry as a vendor, was I was very impressed with the new CEO over at Cornerstone. I've had an opportunity to speak with him and discuss what they're seeing as sort of the next steps for Cornerstone. And what was really nice is that organization has simply moved from, being a private company to being an IPO'd and then a public company and then being bought again back to a private equity firm company. And a lot of times when those kind of transitions happen, you tend to see that organizations don't invest in growth and innovation over time, right? And that is not what I heard from this leadership team. I heard a lot of expectations that they're going to continue to invest in all their product areas and reinvest in services and delivery. And they really had, I think, probably one of the best meetings I had was with Toya, who is their head of customer service that they've recently installed. And she basically walked through sort of a brand new approach, then really back to the basics for Cornerstone of doing customer service. Teri, you've worked for public companies and non-public companies and private equity firms. Like, how does that kind of shift the inner workings inside of these kind of organizations and the conversations that they have about what they can do, what they can invest resources in, and how they're rolling up information? Can you maybe give some insight to our audience about that?
Sure. Yeah, it is interesting, the path that they've gone down over the last 10 or 15 years at Cornerstone. And I have to imagine that's, created some decent turmoil within the organization during those periods. But I hear you. I've seen from them, they are still out in front. They continue to acquire. They continue to roll out new features and functionality. They seem very focused on the future of HR tech. And I think that's a good thing. Obviously, sometimes when you see these go internally, they take a different focus. They may take their eye off the ball or start to focus a little bit differently after that acquisition or even before. So I think obviously they've got some good management because they do seem to be heavily focused on the market and heavily focused on customer success and continuing to expand their product line. I mean, they're, learning management, that was the thing 10 years ago, right? And now they do so much more. I'm not sure a lot of people put them at the top of the list when they think of more broad capabilities. Like it's still, thought of as learning in many circles. Yeah. So I think that's an area that they'll probably continue to work on is, getting to making sure they're known across the space. And, they're more of an HCM play than just a learning management system.
Yeah. And what's really, I think, fascinating about that is that, this year in our research data set, we sort of opened up the conversation about sort of learning solutions. And there's so many more players when you just think broadly about learning solutions. There's performance support tools, there's content creation tools, there's all those things. But when we sort of looked across our data set, Cornerstone got really high ratings in performance management as well as their learning area, right? And so to your point, I think what we see is that what Cornerstone has been able to do is make maybe learning the center of the conversation, but bring with it all of the sort of areas that are powerful about learning, which is connecting it to performance management, connecting it to workflows inside the organizations, connecting it to the, even the recruiting process that they're spending and investing time in. Really thinking more broadly about sort of the whole talent conversation. And then they were really the first to that table. And I think to some extent, they might end up being I know the next big conversation around the experience of the employee would be an organization like them that's got both the capability to do development inside of your organization and externally as well with the extended platforms that they've got. So it'll be really interesting. I think Himanshu, who's the new CEO and executive over there, is really got a good, clear direction for where they're heading. I had great conversations with Toya Del Val, who is their chief customer officer, as I noted, as well as their chief financial officer, Ryan Corson. I was quite impressed with him when he spoke with us because he was very open to the fact that, a lot of the feedback I've given them, because we get it through our survey, is customer care is important. Cornerstone used to be one of those top-notch implementation and customer care organizations. It's one of the reasons why their customers stayed with them for so long. Through this transition, I think, as you mentioned, right, there's been a bit of chaos, and they've lost some of that. And it was one of my main questions when I was there, was asking them, are they going to reinvest in that area? It's not an area oftentimes invested in by companies who are trying to increase a stock price, because services oftentimes not looked at as valuable as the software itself and the repeatable business. But it was very clear that both from Ryan and Himanshu and Toya that they're planning to invest in whatever is needed to grow the company and ensure their customers are happy. And that was nice to hear, which included the services conversation. So it'll be, I think, an opportunity to see where they're heading. On the flip side, I also had the opportunity while I was there in Las Vegas to head over to Oracle HCM's Users Conference. Now, it was Oracle Cloud World, so it was much bigger than just HCM. It was all of their cloud applications, which included their finance and their systems. I didn't get a chance to be at all the analyst events, so I didn't have all the announcements, but I did speak to a couple of their customers, and that was really good to see sort of some of the success they've had in areas like recruiting. I guess some great conversations with a couple of their customers around recruiting. We had some really good conversations with a couple of their customers around how they're integrating their analytics platform with their HR data sets. Those I think are all good places where Oracle has seen positive interactions. When we looked at what was talked about at the keynote for Oracle, boy, was Larry Ellison was there in video and on his true usual sort of, here's where we're heading, we're going to take over the future kind of conversation. And this year it seemed to be really all around healthcare. Teri, you and I have had this conversation. Healthcare as a technology is a big issue. We work with a lot of healthcare organizations, and they're trying to figure out how they're connecting Epic and Cerner and all those healthcare solutions into what's going on with the workforce. Do you think that's one of the next frontiers for how we think about sort of, we're going to manage healthcare through a digital perspective?
I do. I think HR, human resources, right? They follow the trajectory of their employees and the workforce and what that workforce is looking for and asking for and complaining about. And I think right now, wellness, financial well-being, but also health and physical well-being are at the top of the chart in terms of what people care about right now. And so I do think this is going to be a big topic over the next couple of years, is how do we extend this? And maybe this is the new comp, right? We've got to focus on how we take our workforce to the next level through their well-being. And I agree with you. I think this is going to be an opportunity for organizations to look at that. And they've got to do something. I mean, I just had a conversation about quiet quitting and that, whole area. Well, why are employees quietly quitting? And, some of it's a little bit difficult to understand because on the one hand, they're financially stressed. On the other hand, they're quietly quitting. They're not working. They're not doing more than they're being asked to do. So there's some conundrum there. Why is this happening? But a lot of it is because people have refocused themselves and said, I can't work the 80 hours that I used to work. I need this time to myself. I need to pay attention to myself, my family, my personal ecosystem in order to be good at what I do.
Yeah.
And that no longer equals the, 80 or more hours that I spent working. So yes, I absolutely think that's going to be a big opportunity.
Yeah. I just had a really great conversation on the same topic, but sort of in a flip side with a friend of mine who works over at a weather data organization, right? So they basically track data models around weather. And then they sell that information back to companies to help them sort of manage supply chains and to manage the work that they're doing, even for workforce deployments, right? And we were talking about this issue that, it does feel a bit like the current generation oftentimes wants more personal time, wants more space, wants more balance, right? As you were talking about the fact that, we can't work 80 hours. I remember when I was 30 and 35, it was a lot easier maybe to work 80 hours, but I probably shouldn't have been, right?
Right.
I was gonna say, now I feel like I'm like, boy, I'm just way too old for this. But even when I could do it, should I have been doing it, right? And we had this great conversation about the fact that, I think there's this idea on the client quitting of the conversation that what businesses are trying to figure out, through the recruiting process and through their experience and through their approach, how they keep employees engaged. And one of the things that we're realizing is that this next generation is not coming into the organization saying, I'm going to work X number of hours. I'm going to work really hard to get promoted, to get moved into new roles and stuff. They're really coming into these organizations oftentimes saying, I need you to prove to me that if I put that kind of energy in, you're going to value it. It's a little different shift from, I want to, especially when you're doing assessments and recruiting, I want to find that person who's going to put that extra time in. And instead flipping that a little bit and saying, what do we as a company have to do to prove to you that there's value in you investing time in us? And I think that's a thing that most recruiting and organizations just aren't ready for that kind of a conversation yet, even though we've been talking about it for a long time.
Right, exactly. And it's another form of how do we make sure that we're obviously pay is a big part of that, but with the economy and the changes that are, we're seeing on the horizon, they're going to need to find other ways to compensate people and make sure that they feel valued for the work that they're delivering, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, they don't need a pat on the back every day, but they do need to know that I just invested 80 hours to get this project done and it was worth it. And that 80 hours shouldn't be every week. It should be not the rule, right? The exception rather than the rule. I'm willing to put that time in if I know that, there's going to be some reward at the end of that.
Yeah. And the nice thing is that, we're talking about this in the context of some of the stuff that we saw coming out of the Oracle environment. As sort of we move through this market, we start to see some of the people who have been the biggest, I'd say, influencers or people who have been pushing this conversation about bringing your whole self to work and having balance in your work environment actually start to work for many of these vendors. So, it's Chris Leone who heads up the product development over there. You've got Cameron, who is a good friend of mine and who is running sort of the strategy work over there, along with Chris Havrilla. Those are all people who worked with us on in many cases, particularly Yvette and Chris, in the role of analysts or as researchers, researching the value of this kind of conversation. And now they're rolling into vendors where they're basically hopefully having the same kind of conversations there. So I do think we're going to start to see the vendors not just talk about this as good marketing, right? But at building these into the systems. And that's what I'm really looking for, is it really having an impact on the system side? And, the other thing that we did last week was actually talk to a group of CHROs. This was probably the most fascinating thing about last week. We got to go to Chicago and we had 4 or 5 meetings while we were in Chicago, which, by the way, it was beautiful weather while we were out there. So, I'm living down in the South now, but I'm an Ohio girl at heart. And it was definitely nice to kind of get that nippy wind in the air. But neither you nor I brought the right level of coats for that week, I will say.
The Windy City, right?
Windy City. We should have been a little bit maybe brighter on that one. But that was definitely my fault. I should have known better. But while we were there, had a room of probably 30, 40 CHROs who were all from investment organizations, some really small, some really large. And we were sort of overseeing a panel on HR technology for that market. And I was fascinated by the conversations that we were still having in that room, where we were talking about changing still from on-premise to cloud solutions, right? Where we were talking about the challenges with position management, models, right? Like those are really very on the ground kind of issues that many CHROs are still dealing with. They can't even get to, I think, the well-being conversation sometimes, right?
Right. Yeah. It was interesting listening to some of the people at the tables, in addition to listening to the actual discussion that you guys were having on the stage, and just understanding what people, some of these people were still using just whatever their finance system was. So HR hadn't really been thought of as a technology at that point. It was just sort of, we need to get these things done. And now, 300-400 employees later, it's okay, we need real HR technology, not just what our finance team is doing, or not just managing expenses, or, having a headcount report. There's a lot of other things we need to be doing and thinking about. And by the way, they're competing for the same talent that the big companies are at this stage.
Without a doubt, right? And it was sort of an interesting, as we were preparing for that session, we had some interesting conversations about, this is one of the industries, particularly financial services, right, where they get hit hardest first on whenever we're seeing economic downturns, right? And in 2008, there was a huge shift and kind of starting with financial firms all the way into retail and then into manufacturing and other areas, right? As cycles turn, to basically cut large swaths of people inside of organizations as the market started to soften, and to do it quickly and to do it early so that you could get ahead of it, right? I did not hear that same kind of sentiment from this market at all this year. And I also heard much more of we want to figure out how to do this we know we're going to probably have to manage our talent approach a little bit for the next several years. We know that we're still have talent gaps in critical roles. So it wasn't like they had a plethora of people to take positions either. So they still had talent gaps. That was still part of the conversation. But I thought what was really good was to hear that almost everybody was having a conversation about.
Yes, I think that is a challenge. And the other thing that I heard at this roundtable was the challenges of implementation. And to me, that spoke volumes about what we've learned coming out of the survey, which is those organizations that are doing things really well when it comes to HR technology have adaptable change management solutions, right? They're doing it as part of practice and not as part of project. And that's what I heard from a lot of these organizations is these implementations have not gone as well as they'd hoped, or they just didn't know what they didn't know when they were implementing something. And now they've got solutions that don't do exactly what they had hoped they would do. And I think a lot of that goes back to the change management conversation.
Yeah. And what was interesting is a lot of them had partners through the change management process, or at least through the implementation process, right? But I think even the partners oftentimes were thinking a project, right? Like it was a beginning, middle, and end. I think, I love that mantra. Maybe Teri, we'll tell the market to put out, if you're going to be talking about trying to help people through their implementations, make sure you're noting you don't know what you don't know, right?
Exactly.
It's definitely a common theme we hear through our research. It's a common theme we hear when we have these conversations, right? And it's makes such a big difference in the outcomes people are able to achieve. Just as kind of a last wrap up on the conversation then today, I do want to talk a little bit about the visit we did to AtlasHXM. They are an employer of record. They are an organization they're not very large at this point, but they are large in the scale of what they offer, right? Like, so at this point, if sort of the numbers kind of, I think are sort of up and down a little bit, but in general, it sounded like they had somewhere in the range of like 130 to 160 different countries that they can hire an employee for you in a country. And basically it's not a co-share employment model like a PEO would be. It's more of an employer of record. Basically that person is solely hired by the organization, but then they're basically working with you through a contract basis and service level agreements to allow you basically to have an employee through some standard legal documentation that is in another country that as a small business you might not have the ability to do. We talked with them a little bit at HR Tech, Teri. Now that we got a chance to sort of see some of the product and see them in person and in their offices, this employer of record is something I think it's pretty big as a topic, right? Like I think that this is going to be something that we're going to hear a lot more about, not just because of hybrid, but because workforces are changing and we need to be able to get skill sets and talent everywhere. But would you agree? I mean, it was a long conversation we had.
It was a fascinating conversation. And, even you and I initially, when they were first on our radar, we were like, well, they're another PEO, right? And they happen to be global, which obviously, if you have international people having a PEO in every country is a challenge. So we thought, hey, this is another PEO who's figured out how to do this internationally. They kept saying, no, we're an EOR, employee of record. And we said, well, what's the difference? Like, help us understand what that means as an organization. And not until we actually got there and talked through a lot of the challenges with hiring people internationally did the light bulb go off. And, we said basically, wow, that makes a lot of sense. I can see and understand the difference now between a PEO and this employer of record. This is very different. And when I look at it, I think of the compliance issues and just onboarding and messaging and managing people. They've got a good process going on. They understand the issues in all the countries. And they also share that information with the companies that use their solutions. So they sound like a really great partner. I'm anxious to learn more about them as we go and see how they do in the market, because this is a big challenge. I mean, we ourselves have said, hey, we need to get somebody in Europe. How are we going to do that? Like, we can't spin up a company in Europe right now, or even necessarily hire a PEO. That can be complex. So this was really interesting to me. And I think something that we're going to see a lot more of.
Yeah. And I would agree. And just for those maybe who don't know what a PEO, I realize maybe we should probably give a definition of that. Yeah. So PEO is a professional employer organization. And here in the United States, is it a co-ownership of that employee? Basically, on paper, both of you are responsible for taxes and updates and information and all that stuff, right? Like, so there's joint responsibility to some extent when you're using a PEO. It's a great tool for small businesses. We're seeing an uptick in the use of PEOs, even for larger organizations. It used to be that sort of you kind of top down at about 200 employees, and you probably went into it maybe like at around 25 to 50 when you started wanting to get better healthcare, those kind of things for employees and management. But we are seeing that even larger organizations up to like 500 are now starting to leverage PEOs because there's just a need to, particularly in healthcare and other areas, you can get better pricings through those environments. But internationally, a lot of times there's real regulations against doing co-management or co-responsibility for employees. And so I think this is one of the things that I was fascinated by when we were talking to Atlas, was that they were, not only were they handling the technical side, which is most important from what we're studying and the tools and the things that they're using, but they're handling that sort of compliance side of this conversation, as you had mentioned, right? And making sure that every contract they're compliant, they understand how long you can have an employee in certain positions and roles. They understand if you're wanting to do contingent work with them initially, first, what that might look like. And again, every country has different regulations around that. That compliance component is massive. And we see a few vendors who do this quite well. Also, like understanding compliance of the areas that they're in. Ceridian and ADP are really big on those kind of payroll compliance things. I don't know that I've seen a lot of organizations understand sort of the contractor slash sort of employment laws all the time in these regions. And that, I think, was the piece that really, I was like, wow, that's something different from what we're seeing in just a piece of software.
Yeah, that's big. And the other thing that they did that I think puts them out in front to some extent is they went and got themselves set up in a lot of countries where they hadn't hired anybody yet. Because, it could take months, if not longer, to get a license in a particular country to operate as a business. So having that now makes it pretty easy for them to onboard some people in a country where you're trying to hire somebody without that rigmarole, right? Of going through all the legalities of starting up an entity there.
Yeah, I would say it's someone that everyone probably wants to watch a little bit. I really was impressed with their leadership. Rick Hamill, who's their CEO, Atlanta boy, right? We were having good conversations about being in the South and what it different foods and all the different things about being in the South. But that was the thing I think that was really, he had taken his knowledge of sort of working in the US and expanded it internationally. And that watching sort of his story of how he went through this process was really amazing, right? I just really loved sort of his journey, I guess, was a powerful journey, right?
It was, yeah. Just all the things that he had gone through and kind of kept questioning, like we all do, like, why are we doing it this way? Or yes. Is there a better way to do this? And, he sort of took that idea and ran with it. And I think they've got a pretty good gig going on. I'm anxious to see how how they evolve.
Yeah. And Chelsea Griggs, who's head of strategy over there. I mean, I've worked with her in past in other organizations. I mean, she knows her business in this space. So again, it'll be fun to see where they head out. Well, we've talked about quite a bit of topics this week. There's a lot of other stuff that happened this week. We'll probably touch in our next segment on Spilling the Tea in HR Tech in about 2 weeks, which I'll be doing from Stockholm at the European Workday Rising event. So tune in for that if you get a chance. And we'll then talk a little bit about some of the acquisitions that happened over the last couple of weeks, probably the Vizier acquisition, as well as some of the other recruiting tools that we know have gone through some acquisitions this week. So it's lots of exciting stuff to keep talking down the market about. You have any specific areas or topics you'd like us to talk about here on Spilling the Tea in HR Tech or in our other podcast, HR We Have a Problem, please be sure to let us know. Send an email or a comment in. We'd love to hear that. Additionally, we also want to make sure that everyone who's out there, wherever you get your podcast at, that you make sure you like and follow us. This is the most important thing, is what I'm learning from podcasts. I've done podcasts for over 5 years, Teri, and nobody told me that the most important thing was how many people liked and followed you, right? I was like, it's just how many people downloaded you, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. So please be sure to like and follow us. This is a big metric that we're excited about being able to bring the news and the information about what's happening in the HR technology space to you guys every couple of weeks. And we'll continue to do that, and would love to hear comments about if we're hitting the right topics and if we're helping you make some decisions yourself about what's going on in HR tech. So Teri, any last minute comments about our week this week for the audience before we wrap up?
It's a bit of a whirlwind, and I don't see it slowing down.
No, not in the least. Just to let people know, right? We're going to be, I've got 2 conferences next week. UKG is doing their conference for their users. I'll be at that. We'll be at Ceridian's Users Conference. Like I said, then the week after that, I'll be in Stockholm at the Workday's European User Conference. So there will be a lot of things to update in just 2 weeks already. So yes, I would say whirlwind is a good term to use. Thanks, everyone. We're excited about all the upcoming news and information and the research that we'll be publishing here soon. Again, please feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions, and like and follow us wherever you get your podcast at.